Although Reich's President Hindenburg thought little of Adolf Hitler, he contemptuously called him a Bohemian corporal, on the 30th of January 1933 he appointed him Chancellor of the Reich. A weakened Weimar Republic, still only governable by means of emergency decrees, had now opened the gates to power for the Nazi Party. Jubilant, Hitler's brown hordes celebrated their successes with torchlit processions and parades. On February the 27th, the Reichstag, Germany's parliament, was set on fire. SS propaganda blamed the arson attack on the communists, although it is believed to have been started by the SS themselves as an excuse to draft a new law, the Reichstag Arson Act. This act now made it legally possible to make random arrests without court judgment, and in the next few weeks thousands were arrested all over Germany. At first it was the political left, the communists and socialists, that felt the brunt of these mass arrests. There wasn't enough space in the prisons to hold all the detainees, and improvised detention camps were erected all over Germany. The Nazi Party also secured the power of the police under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler. Police regulations were altered in order that SS men be appointed police assistants. On the 20th of March 1933, Himmler announced the building of a concentration camp at Dachau. What began as a political re-education camp went on to become a model for all other concentration camps. 2 days later, the first political prisoners were transported to Dachau. A system of terror began which could not be compared with any other system of persecution and punishment. From this place of crime a monstrous reign of terror set forth, contemptuous of all humanity. Heinrich Himmler, a fanatical racist and one of the most powerful figures of the Third Reich, was in charge, among other things, of the leadership of the SS and the concentration camps. In April 1933, the SS took over the guard duties and organisation of Dachau and other concentration camps. Tied in this way to the SS, the camps became a very potent tool to the Hitler dictatorship by spreading fear amongst the German population. Himmler is seen here visiting Dachau concentration camp. He appointed Hilmar Wackerl as the first camp commandant, but he only lasted a few weeks. His successor was Theodor Eicke, a ruthless and unscrupulous organiser who was the first commandant to perfect the deadly system of the concentration camps. Eicke was transferred directly to Dachau in June, after a few weeks' stay in a psychiatric hospital in Würzburg. In 1934, Himmler appointed him the inspector of all concentration camps and later a commander in the Totenkopf or Death's Head division of the SS. Sometime later in his career, Eicke moved into this building at Oranienburg. From here he managed, organised and planned the administration of all the concentration camps situated inside Germany. By the autumn of 1934, the camp's SS guards were separated from the normal SS troops and they came under the personal control of Eicke. He and Himmler saw the SS Totenkopf troops as elite soldiers or as an order within the SS which could be moulded. So Dachau became a training camp for all the SS guards up until 1938.
Also in Dachau wurde sozusagen eingeübt, was später in den großen Vernichtungszentren durchgeführt wurde. Die SS der ersten Jahre des Bestehens des Konzentrationslagers, die mit sehr niedrigen Rängen angefangen haben.
This school of brute force produced, among others, the future commandant of Auschwitz, Adolf Eichmann, a previously desk-bound officer whose terrible legacy was that he was to become responsible for the final solution of the Jewish question. Other commandants of Dachau were Hans Loritz, seen here, third from the left. Alex Pierkowski, another commandant, is seen here shaking hands with Himmler. The punishment and disciplinary orders that were current in Dachau can be traced back to Theodor Eicke, and they were carried out in all the other concentration camps throughout the Reich. The terror methods including robbing the camp inmates of their dignity, as well as encouraging them to spy on and mistreat each other by a cleverly devised system of using prisoners as supervisors. SS tortures were applied to the inmates, such as being hung from a stake or a tree by their arms, which were tied behind their backs, impalings and severe whippings. Former inmate Josef Felder remembers.
Nun, jeder, der da ankam, damals war es so, das ist sicher später noch viel schlimmer gewesen, der bekam, wenn er die Haare herunter hatte und die Sträflingskleidung an, dann musste er zur Kommandantur und dann musste er die Hose runterlassen und sich über einen Block legen und dann bekam er mit dem Ochsenziemer, sagt man in Bayern, den Ochsenfiesel, bekam er nach der Lagerordnung, in der Lagerordnung stehend, 25 Stockschläge auf den nackten Hintern. Und dann haben sie gesagt, 5, 6, 7, jetzt haben wir uns verzählt, müssen wir wieder anfangen. Sie haben meistens die Zahl, die selbst verordnet war, also festgehalten war, überschritten, sodass das Fleisch verletzt wurde. Nicht wahr? Und dann haben sie die Leute ins Revier geworfen.
Once they entered the camp, the prisoners were robbed of their clothes, names and all human dignity. They were given a number and a category. For this categorization, prisoners had to wear a piece of cloth with a particular colour and marking attached to their uniform. The colours and markings issued to prisoners in the main were adjudged on national, religious and social standings. In many cases, these badges were the deciding factor between life and death.
Bis 1938 waren nur Deutsche im Konzentrationslager Dachau. Und in der damals bereits bestehenden Hierarchie standen die deutschen politischen Gefangenen an der Spitze und die Häftlinge, denen es weitaus am schlechtesten ging, waren immer die jüdischen Gefangenen.
This aerial footage taken of Dachau concentration camp in 1945 clearly demonstrated the specific way in which the space was defined. It shows two large separate areas, one area for the prisoners and the other for the prison command. The border between these two areas was divided by a high-voltage electric fence. This topographical layout adopted in the camps can be traced back to Theodor Eicke. For reasons of space, the camp was extended in 1937. A completely new rectangular prison camp with 30 barracks was created. The security measures in the camp were also considerably increased. A Polish prisoner, Felix Rack, registered as number 18425, described the sadness of the camp in a poem he wrote, Dachau in Sunshine. In sunshine I got to know the hell that was Dachau, a camp, a row of barracks, a walled fence, a ditch, wires connected to the deadly electrical current, high towers on which the SS men keep guard at night and also through the day, the machine gun ever ready. Like shadows, the starving prisoners move about. I got to know the concentration camp here. This prison block in the camp was known as the bunker. Political, intellectual and prominent prisoners were incarcerated here. Solitary confinement and abuse were the orders of the day. This is one of the two crematoriums which were situated in the camp. These were known as X-barracks. On this square in front of the administration building, the prisoners had to appear twice a day for roll call every day of the year in all weathers. If a prisoner was missing from roll call, usually due to illness, then the others had to often stand on the spot for hours on end. This is a reconstruction of the prisoners' barracks at Dachau. Each barrack was approximately 100 meters long and 10 meters wide and contained 2 rooms. One was used by the prisoners as a day room, and the other room was used as a dormitory. Initially, each barrack was designed to house 208 prisoners, but by the end of 1944 there were 1,600 prisoners in each barrack. The hygiene facilities were totally insufficient for the number of inmates. At the beginning, Dachau was exclusively a political camp. Even the first German Jews who were interned in the camp had been arrested by the Gestapo on account of their political convictions. Communists, Democrats, Unionists, Socialists and Conservatives had all been fighting each other before 1933. They now found themselves suddenly together behind the barbed wire. Josef Jus, a member of parliament, spent almost 4 years in Dachau concentration camp, and he talks about everyday life there.
Immer auf Draht sein müssen, immer wach. Einen Augenblick nur vergessen, wo wir sind. Eine schlechte Laune des Lagerführers, des Block- oder Stubenältesten und wir fallen auf. Werden gedemütigt, beschimpft, getreten, geschlagen. Die geringste Widerrede, ein unglückliches Zucken der Muskeln und wir werden gemeldet, bestraft durch stundenlanges Stehen am Lagertor, in strammer Haltung, in Sturm und Wetter, durch Entzug der Nahrung, durch Stockhiebe. Das niederdrückende Gefühl absoluter Ohnmacht, Recht und Schutzlosigkeit gegenüber toll gewordenen Gewalten.
Johann Georg Elser was a prisoner in Dachau who didn't survive the Nazi terror, being murdered just before the end of the war, having been spared for years whilst awaiting a show trial. On the 8th of November 1939, he'd made an attempt on Hitler's life. Nazi propaganda had tried to make an international conspiracy out of the attempted assassination, although he'd carried out the deed alone. Elsa had decided to kill Hitler during a rally in a Munich beer cellar. Working over many nights, he planted a bomb in a pillar near the podium. At 8:10 in the evening, there was a huge explosion. The ceiling collapsed onto the visitors, 8 people were killed and 60 were wounded, but Hitler was not among the victims, for he had left the beer cellar just 3 minutes earlier. Elsa was later seized by the Gestapo. On cross-examination, he said Hitler's death would have ended the slavery and ended the war. Dachau was the largest concentration camp for the clergy. Churchmen were brought here from all the other concentration camps until finally there were over 2,700 interned from 27 different nations. Before this, Hitler had tried to approach the two main faiths with the intention of monopolizing both for himself to preside over. The victims of these arrests were rebellious churchmen. Catholic priest Herk was arrested for delivering a critical sermon.
Bei uns in dieser Gruppe war Neuhäusler, Niemöller, Höck und dann Hofmeister, Corbinian Hofmeister von Metten. Dann ist er eingeliefert worden, zu uns gekommen mit einem Beamten von der Gestapo und dann hat er den Mut gehabt und hat dem ins Gesicht gesagt, so haben sie mich jetzt gut abgeliefert hier in diesem Gefängnis, ja. Er hat gesagt, ich danke Ihnen, dass Sie mich lebend begraben haben jetzt. Ja? Denn damit musste man rechnen, dass Sie sozusagen, wenn Sie einen reinbrachten, den gar nicht mehr rauskommen ließen und von ihm auch nichts annahmen an Verteidigung, an Rechtfertigung für sein Leben.
The German Christian group, with support from the National Socialist, infiltrated the Protestant church. There was resistance to this. Pastor Niemöller was a figurehead in the movement, whose stance against the Nazis led to his arrest. In 1937 he was incarcerated in Dachau as a personal prisoner of the Führer. Pastor Niemöller survived the camp and was liberated by the Allies at the end of the war. In spite of the harsh conditions of imprisonment in the camp, some of the clergy still managed to give moral support to their fellow inmates. Prelate Herk was able to give some pastoral care.
Und ich bin dann reingegangen und dann war ich etwa so 2 Stunden bei ihm, haben beruhigt, er war verheiratet, hat ein Kind daheim gehabt, einen Buben, mein Gott, und hat mir sein ganzes Leid geklagt und ich habe ihn dann getröstet, er hat gebeichtet, hat die Kommunion empfangen und am nächsten Morgen wurde er zur Hinrichtung geführt auf den Schießplatz der SS. Nicht? Und das war schon ein Sinn, ein tiefer Sinn, warum wir drin waren und dass wir täglich von Weihnachten, also 41 bis zum Schluss, bis wir dann der Osterwoche 1945 herauskamen, täglich die Heilige Messe feiern konnten.
Barbara Dichtel explains how religious practice and social hierarchy were tied up together in the camps.
Aber auch unter den Geistlichen gab es eine Hierarchie. Es gab die deutschen und österreichischen Geistlichen, denen es schließlich erlaubt wurde, eine Kapelle einzurichten in einer der Baracken. Es war aber wiederum etwa den polnischen Geistlichen, die weitaus die größte Zahl unter den Geistlichen stellte, verboten, an den Gottesdiensten in dieser Baracke teilzunehmen. Und unter den polnischen Geistlichen gab es auch bei Weitem die meisten Todesfälle. Etwa die Hälfte der 1600 polnischen Geistlichen, die hier im Lager Dachau inhaftiert waren, sind hier ums Leben gekommen.
Munich, July the 18th, 1937. The Nazis celebrate the opening of a new German temple of art. Hitler, the would-be painter from the Austrian district of Branau, celebrates a late, if not doubtful, triumph of aesthetics. Mediocre Nazi paintings were the only exhibits to be seen in the gallery. This banal blood and earth art was expected to deliver to the German people total belief in their Aryan roots. Previously, 600 classical paintings had been removed because they were declared to be not art. Taking place at the same time was a festival depicting 2,000 years of German culture. The arrogant superiority of the Germanic master race was put on show. What was now a popular spectacle would soon become a cruel reality. 75 miles southeast of Munich lies Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat, nestling 1,700 feet up in the Alps. In this mountain fortress, the Führer withdrew with Eva Braun and his closest followers, protected by his Leibstandarte SS bodyguard. Dignities that Hitler wanted to overwhelm and impress were received here. In February 1938, he met the Austrian Federal Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg. Hitler forced an agreement on him that would allow Nazi activity to freely flourish in Austria. This culminated on the 12th of March 1938 with the German army marching into and annexing Austria. There was little protest from the Western nations.
Als Führer und Kanzler der deutschen Nation und des Reichs melde ich vor der deutschen Geschichte nunmehr den Eintritt meiner Heimat in das Deutsche Reich.
Almost immediately after annexation, Catholic Austria, under Nazi rule, no longer tolerated Jews. Those Jews that hadn't succeeded in fleeing the country by the summer of 1938 found themselves being rounded up and transported to Dachau concentration camp. On October the 1st, as agreed in the Munich Pact, Hitler marched into and occupied the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia. Here, as in Austria, Jews and other unwanted elements were hunted down, arrested and transported to Dachau. In 1938 alone, almost 19,000 prisoners were interred in Dachau concentration camp. After the declared independence of pro-German Slovakia, the remainder of Czechoslovakia was under threat of collapse. This caused the Czech state president to place the fate of his people in the hands of the Führer. German troops began to move into Bohemia and Moravia, and Hitler followed in jubilation. Hitler's expansionist move eastwards, so far without bloodshed, were soon to take on an open form of war. On the 1st of September 1939, with an attack on Poland, the Second World War was unleashed and Europe was set on fire. Hitler's excuse was that the Greater Fatherland needed more living space. He made war on two fronts, one against Poland and one against the Jews. Graffiti daubed on the carriages of trains going into the war zones stated quite openly, "We are going to Poland to beat up the Jews." Through racial cleansing and dictatorial ideology, Hitler wanted to construct a 1,000-year Reich with a perfect Aryan society, and so began the barbaric and inhuman treatment against the Jews in Poland and later throughout Europe. In 1939, an American documentary predicted the number of Jews under dire threat from the Nazi war machine as it ploughed through Europe. On the 9th of April 1940, German forces invaded Denmark and Norway. This was to safeguard their import of iron ore from neutral Sweden, which was absolutely vital for the German armament programme. The battle continued on against the Allies into May. As defences were falling away, the steady progress of the German army was leading them towards the Low Countries. From early May onwards, the German campaign continued south, with the neutral states of Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg being completely overrun by German forces. Rotterdam and other major cities were left in flames. Hitler's tanks were rolling tirelessly forwards, and the tracks of war were moving ever deeper into France. On the 21st of June 1940, France surrendered and German troops marched triumphantly through the deserted streets of Paris. More and more prisoners were being rounded up and transported to the concentration camps in Germany. This raised the number of inmates interred in Dachau since the start of the war to almost 23,000. In the spring of 1941, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria entered a pact with Germany and Italy. Yugoslavia and Greece put up a fight, but were eventually conquered and occupied. On the Balkan front, the Germans were at their most zealous, organising deportations and committing mass killings. In June 1941, just after signing a non-aggression pact with Stalin, Hitler massed his troops on the Eastern Front and attacked Russia. Alongside the economic and military considerations, it was above all the race consideration that played the decisive part in his strategy. The Eastern Campaign was from the beginning a war of annihilation and enslavement. The elimination of the Jews was the German aim. The occupying troops proceed to act mercilessly against the civilian population. Equal brutality was administered against Russian prisoners of war. Mass shootings were the order of the day for the SS death squads. Whole villages were destroyed. The male population was rounded up and shot. The women folk and their children were sent to the concentration camps. Those captives deemed fit and suitable for slave labour were sent to transit camps. Himmler is seen here visiting such a camp in Minsk. Tens of thousands of Russian prisoners of war were sent to Dachau. So that transportation of the prisoners could be carried out efficiently, the Reich Railway supplied dedicated timetables. The death trains were nothing more than old cattle trucks with bare rotting boards. High up was a small air vent covered with barbed wire. There were no seats. Prisoners stood up, crammed one against the other. The deportations were all the same. This scene of a Dutch assembly camp in Westerbork is the only known movie footage taken of a deportation. On these rail journeys, prisoners were often penned in like cattle for days on end, without food, without water, without toilets. Many of them died before reaching the camps. On these railway lines, between 1933 and 1945, death trains brought thousands of prisoners to Dachau. By war's end, there were almost 250,000 prisoners registered in Dachau, and this figure doesn't include the thousands of Russian POWs that were selected for mass shootings. From the beginning of the war, with the enormous intake of prisoners, the structures and functions of the camps changed. The SS hierarchy recognized that there was a lucrative business to be made by selling the services of prisoners as slave labor to armament factories and private firms. This system was developed by SS leader Pohl. At Dachau there were 197 outside camps, mostly involved with the munitions industry. From these prisoners' deployment documents, it emerges that renowned German companies tapped into this workforce. BMW, Dornier and Messerschmitt were known to have employed slave labour direct from the camps. While these companies and the SS profited financially from this arrangement, for the slave labourers it was extermination through work. A film, The Eternal Jew, released by the Nazi Party, was intended to promote even further race hatred against the Jews in Europe. Here we see an extract.
Wo Ratten auch auftauchen, tragen sie Vernichtung ins Land, zerstören sie menschliche Güter und Nahrungsmittel. Auf diese Weise verbreiten sie Krankheiten, Pest, Lepra, Typhus, Cholera, Ruhr und so weiter. Sie sind hinterlistig, feige und grausam und treten meist in großen Scharen auf. Sie stellen unter den Tieren das Element der heimtückischen unterirdischen Zerstörung dar. Nicht anders als die Juden unter den Menschen.
On January the 20th, 1942, there was a meeting in this villa at Wannsee on the outskirts of Berlin. At Hitler's request, Reinhard Heydrich chaired this meeting of senior SS leaders, and they were here to find an answer to the Jewish question. The proposed plan was to comb Europe from west to east, rounding up all the Jews, a figure Heydrich put at approximately 11 million. They were to be transported to death camps, mostly in the east, the fit ones initially to be used as slave labour until the work killed them, the remainder to be exterminated immediately. The plan was given a title, The Final Solution. Medical experiments were carried out on prisoners in Dachau. These were endorsed in a letter sent on the 4th of December 1942 by SS leader Heinrich Himmler. Under the instruction of Dr. Rascher, prisoners were put into icy water. The temperature was then lowered until they were unconscious. Revival was then tried with different methods of heating the body. This was to emulate the plight of Luftwaffe aircrew who ditched in the sea. This experiment was also for the benefit of aircrew, testing the body's endurance when ejecting from a plane at height. A selected prisoner was put into a pressure chamber. He was then gradually deprived of oxygen until he lost consciousness. Various new methods were used in order to revive the human guinea pig, but to no avail. This prisoner died and afterwards underwent a meticulous autopsy. Prisoners were also used for other experiments. These included tests performed on further human guinea pigs with malaria pathogens, and their pathways to death were carefully charted. These experiments were conducted by Dr. Schilling. He was put on trial at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal and sentenced to death. His last wish before being hanged was, "I would have liked to have been able to see my experiments through to the end." In the spring of 1941, Hitler's Third Reich, which was supposed to have lasted 1,000 years, was crumbling. The bombing and shelling of the Allied forces was bringing the 12-year reign of terror to an end. The Russian army was steadily advancing in the east towards the SS extermination camps situated there. Himmler had given explicit orders to these extermination camps that, if the Russians were to get near, they were to transport or march the prisoners to other camps in Germany and to destroy all evidence of their horrific deeds, including the prisoners if necessary. Thousands of prisoners died on the death marches from the camps, many falling by the wayside from sheer exhaustion. On the 29th of April, the American army reached Dachau. The concentration camp is liberated. US soldiers arrest some SS guards. A camp prisoner attacks one of his tormentors. One of the first things the soldiers discover is the last death train to reach Dachau. The train arrived a few days earlier from Buchenwald concentration camp. It is full of dead prisoners. These are some of the poor souls that didn't survive the horrific journey. The inmates look bewildered, still coming to terms with their freedom. Rescuers and able prisoners help the suffering where possible. Some prisoners didn't survive after liberation. They are being buried by their fellow inmates. Local townspeople are forced to come to the camp and witness the terrible atrocities that have been inflicted on so many innocent people. These clothes were shed by the last batch of prisoners visiting the so-called bathhouse. This is the shower room they filed into. But instead of water pouring from the shower heads, they emitted cyanide gas under pressure. With the doors locked and the room airtight, it didn't take long for the prisoners to be killed by the poisonous gas. The gas they used, Zyklon B. The bodies were taken from the gas chamber to the crematorium. These are the charred remains of the last bodies that were cremated. Dachau concentration camp has been restored in part and stands as a monument to the millions that suffered under the Third Reich, and it also reminds the world of the millions that still suffer under tyranny. Oranienburg. This peaceful provincial town 20 miles north of Berlin was to play a special role in the Third Reich, symbolizing terror and destruction. In July 1936, the SS had 50 prisoners brought from the Esterwagen camp to build a large new camp in the Oranienburg suburb of Sachsenhausen. It was to become a model for all later concentration camps. As the walls and barbed wire fences were being built even higher to hide the camp's horrific program from the rest of the world, Hitler was making peaceful overtures at the Olympic Games in Berlin. On the 13th of March 1938, German troops annexed Austria. Political opponents were immediately arrested and many were sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Some months later, on the night of the 9th of November, the reality of violence and terror against the Jews was more evident. Synagogues were burnt down, Jewish shops destroyed, and nearly 100 Jews were murdered. This state-sponsored pogrom was silently tolerated and even welcomed by the German people. The next day, the Jewish population was swept by a wave of arrests. More than 26,000 Jews were taken off to concentration camps. This included 6,000 Jews transported from Berlin to Sachsenhausen. A number were murdered, some were detained, but the majority were released, only to be rearrested and incarcerated at a later date. In March 1939, German troops marched into independent Czechoslovakia. The universities were closed, and the students protesting against the occupation were arrested and deported to Sachsenhausen. Anyone who had thus far remained oblivious to Nazi expansionism were soon rudely awakened when, on September the 1st, Germany attacked Poland. 2 days later, the Allies declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. This was greeted with enthusiasm by the majority of the German people. The war spread rapidly across Western Europe. Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, France, the toll of countries capitulating to Hitler's forces grew. The Wehrmacht marched victoriously through Paris. Hitler was one step nearer world domination. The occupying forces ruled through violence and terror. As a result, in France, as elsewhere, young resistance fighters soon fell into the hands of Nazi police and Nazi justice. Russian prisoners of war such as these at Minsk suffered the same fate as the political opponents of Nazism. These prisoners were transported to Sachsenhausen, where a particularly harsh fate awaited them. Peoples from all nations against which the Wehrmacht conducted its relentless war were locked up in concentration camps. By the end of the war, soldiers and civilians from over 40 countries had passed through the camp at Sachsenhausen. Although Sachsenhausen's capacity was expanded several times, it was hopelessly overcrowded. And it was not long before the first camps and Gestapo prisons were unable to cope with the rising numbers. From October 1941, the Jews were systematically deported from all areas in Germany to ghettos and camps. The camps they were sent to were mainly in the east, such as Auschwitz. In October 1942, 454 Jews were sent from Sachsenhausen to Auschwitz. The Gypsies, like the Jews, were also subjected to systematic persecution. Hitler's program was to eradicate these people from Europe, along with homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so-called antisocial elements, the people with worthless lives, as the Nazis put it. Together, these people were the earliest victims of organized mass exterminations in concentration camps. As the war progressed, more and more concentration camps were needed throughout the Reich to accommodate the ever-growing mass of prisoners. The large intake of prisoners to Sachsenhausen caused a steady decline in living conditions. Each barrack was originally designed to house 140 inmates. Instead, 400 were crammed into the wooden hovels, suffering beatings from SS guards. From as early as 1933, most leading communists were under arrest. Social Democrats also paid for their anti-Nazi views. Julius Leber, a Social Democrat leader, was one of the first prisoners in Sachsenhausen. Released in 1937, he was later executed in connection with the attempted assassination of Hitler on July 20th, 1944. Hans von Dohnanyi, one of the key figures in the attempt, was murdered in Sachsenhausen in 1945. Berlin priest Martin Niemöller was incarcerated in Sachsenhausen as a personal prisoner of Hitler. The cell block in Sachsenhausen was for punishments. Prisoners who contravened camp regulations or fell from grace in any way were placed in detention in a blacked-out cell. Here, food rations were even more meagre than usual. For many, a visit to the cells meant certain death. There were also special cells used by the Berlin Gestapo for interrogation and torture. Prisoners were suspended from these hanging posts by their arms, which were shackled behind their backs. For many camp inmates, imprisonment was effectively a death sentence. From August of 1941, approximately 10,000 Russian prisoners of war were brought to Sachsenhausen to be executed, mostly by shooting. Their bodies were taken to the crematorium for burning in the ovens. The concentration camp inspectorate were responsible for the administration and planning of all the concentration camps in German-held territory. From 1938, its offices were based inside the camp at Sachsenhausen. Theodor Eicher was its first inspector. He had previously been in charge of Dachau concentration camp. In March 1942, the inspectorate was incorporated with the Central Department for Economic Administration. The head of this department, Oswald Pohl, had previously pointed out the potential use of the camp inmates as a workforce. From this point on, the prisoners were exploited even more mercilessly as slave workers. Rudolf Höss was in charge of Department Group D under this administration. His department was responsible for the prison conditions and the murder of prisoners in the concentration camps and the mass murders in the extermination camps. Over 200,000 people were incarcerated in Sachsenhausen between 1939 and 1945. The camp was designed and built in a triangular shape. This particular form allowed optimum surveillance from the 8 watchtowers strategically placed along the 3 walls. Arriving on trains, the prisoners were forcibly marched and beaten on their way from the railway station across town to the camp. On this parade ground, prisoners stood for hours, morning and night, day after day, for barrack roll calls. From here, the view of the gallows was unavoidable. The whole camp was surrounded by a high-tension electric barbed wire fence. Escape was impossible. Desperate inmates committed suicide by throwing themselves into the wire mesh. There was dire overcrowding in the barracks. In each barrack there was a small single washroom containing 7 toilets, shared by over 400 inmates. This was the pathology lab. Corpses of inmates that had died from the effects of experiments which were carried out in the sick bay were brought here for dissection and examination. The dead were transferred to the mortuary. Later they are incinerated and their ashes buried. Just outside the perimeter fence there was a special camp. This held Allied officer class POWs. British officers who had made several escape attempts from POW camps were sent here. Theodor Eicke occupied this large villa. The simple buildings alongside housed high-ranking SS officers. The SS guards were housed at the southern edge of the camp. This building was the hospital and hygiene centre for the SS. Opposite the main entrance gate, alongside the drive, is the SS mess. The guard units were fed here. Work brings freedom. This slogan was maliciously emblazoned above many of the entrance gates to the concentration camps. Work brought death to many of the inmates who were tormented, abused, underfed and overworked in the notorious SS workshops and industrial sites. 3 kilometers from Sachsenhausen was the Klinkerwerks. From August 1938 to 1941, 1,800 prisoners used for building the docks and barracks here marched daily to and from Sachsenhausen camp. Many prisoners were worked to death building the docks, mostly Jews, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses and homosexuals. From 1941 onwards, slave workers were housed in their own barracks at the works. From 1942, Sachsenhausen camp supplied slave labour to 100 sub-camps sited in or beside armament factories, most of which were in Berlin. In the Klinkerwerks, labourers worked more than 10 hours a day with an inadequate diet and working at the double under the scrutiny of the sadistic SS guards. Only the foundations of the factory complex remind us of what once took place here. First, tiles were manufactured, and later, up until war's end, stick grenades. The uniform, numbers, stripes and shaven heads were intended to rob them of any individuality. By the end of 1944, German forces were retreating rapidly, and the Russian army were getting nearer to the concentration camps. Trainloads of prisoners were now being diverted to camps in Germany instead of those camps in the east. This included Auschwitz and Majdanek, where they were also slowly transporting prisoners to other camps nearer Germany. Thousands of prisoners were crammed into railway cattle trucks. Many died from hunger, thirst and sheer exhaustion on these hellish journeys. The roar of the distant guns brought the prisoners hope for freedom, but the situation became worse, with the inhuman transport conditions to the west and the nervous SS guards being more liberal with beatings and murders. In the early months of 1945, it was becoming apparent that the war would soon be over. The SS chief Heinrich Himmler gave the order that, on the first sign of the enemy approaching, all concentration camps will march their prisoners west and destroy all incriminating evidence in the camps. On the 20th of April, the evacuation of Sachsenhausen began. Columns of 500 prisoners at a time leaving the camp, all taking different routes. The plan of the SS was to march the prisoners to the Baltic coast, then ship them out to sea and drown them. Because of the size of the Sachsenhausen inmate population, this plan was seen by the SS as the most effective way of killing so many people quickly. They intended to destroy all the evidence that betrayed the horror which took place in the concentration camp. Weakened by incarceration and clothed in just rags, many of the prisoners on the death march broke down under the strain. They were shot immediately. The bedraggled columns reached the forest at Wilktoten, just north of Berlin. Here the prisoners were rested for 4 days and given a few potatoes and porridge to eat. They built makeshift camps and lit fires to keep themselves warm through the bitter cold nights and collected roots to supplement their meagre diet. The death march continued on its way to the Baltic coast. Fortunately, the columns were intercepted by the Swedish Red Cross, who distributed food amongst the starving prisoners, thus saving many lives. But more importantly, they were able to stop the SS guards shooting the exhausted prisoners. Finally, on May the 3rd, after marching for almost 2 weeks, the column was approached by the Russian army and the SS guards fled. The prisoners never reached the Baltic coast. The 3,000 frail and sick prisoners that were left behind in Sachsenhausen were eventually liberated by the Russians on the 22nd of April. Many were so diseased, malnourished and exhausted, they died during their first weeks of freedom. Survivors of Sachsenhausen were transported out, some to resettlement camps and others to their homelands. The war was over. In May 1945, the German army surrendered. The war had cost over 50 million lives. Hitler, Himmler and Goebbels had already committed suicide. 24 other key Nazi figures were tried at Nuremberg in front of an international tribunal. English judge Sir Geoffrey Lauren passed judgment on the defendants. All were found guilty and convicted. Between the 23rd of October and the 1st of November 1947, in the town hall in Berlin-Pankow, a trial took place before a Soviet military tribunal. The accused were 13 SS guards from Sachsenhausen concentration camp, including 2 block guards, plus the commandant. These prisoners had been arrested by the Soviets in 1945 and imprisoned awaiting trial. These are the accused. Anto Keindal, commandant of Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Baum Kotter, the camp doctor who performed experiments on prisoners. Lieutenant Sorg and Nittler, two of the sadistic block guards. Paul Sokovsky, the executioner, was a former prisoner of the camp. In 1939 he was interned by the Nazis as a political prisoner, but the pressure of solitary confinement and regular beatings made him, in 1942, accept the post as the camp hangman and executioner. After execution, the bodies were taken to the crematorium ovens. These were in constant use. The charred bones were ground down to ash. All the defendants were convicted to an average sentence of 25 years and all perished in a Siberian prison, the last one in 1955. The abandoned camp bears witness to the suffering, the degradation, and the horror of what was administered here under Hitler's fascist regime. On the 23rd of April 1961, the East German government erected a national memorial on the site of the former Sachsenhausen concentration camp. In 1995, surviving inmates and families of lost loved ones congregated at the memorial for the 50th anniversary of Sachsenhausen's liberation. Some ex-prisoners donned the uniforms and the distinguishing badges they were wearing on their release. The memorial gave the survivors of Sachsenhausen concentration camp the opportunity to commemorate those who were murdered, to come to terms with their personal memories, and to pass on their experiences to following generations.